Welcome back into another episode of the Believe in Georgia Tech podcast. We're your co-hosts. That is RJ Schafer. I'm Jackson Caudell, coming to you on Friday, June 20th at 11:30. That is when we're recording. Wanted to do a little bit of we haven't done a serious schedule deep dive yet for Georgia Tech in this upcoming season. We're starting to it's that time where you got to start prepping for the season, whether it's, studying. I think we all pretty much know what Georgia Tech's roster is, but kind of looking ahead to the opponents, kind of seeing how things break down. ACC media days are a month away. The first game of the season against Colorado is nearly 2 months away. Like, we're inching closer and closer to football season. So we kind of wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into the schedule and kind of, map it out. And, there's been a lot of talk. Georgia Tech always has one of the hardest schedules, but like this is one of the more favorable ones. And when you kind of dive into it like that is the case. Like, that doesn't mean it's easy, but it is one of the more favorable ones they've had in years, with what could be one of the better teams they've had in quite a long time too. So that could be a really good pairing for a really special season. But really appreciate you guys for tuning in. If you haven't already, would love it if you would subscribe to the show, give us a thumbs up on the video, helps us out a ton. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts as well. We love seeing all the comments and reviews from you guys as well. It's really encouraging, and it's why we do this. So it's really appreciate you guys for doing that. RJ, how you doing, man?
I'm feeling good. We do a schedule talk pretty much every year, and last year that was kind of a dreaded talk because of how bad the schedule is. But I'm actually excited to talk about it this year because, it's a lot better for Tech than in years past. Obviously, you still have a couple of hard games, but we'll get into it. There's a lot of winnable games, and there's a lot of must-win games on the schedule.
Yeah, I think we're both feeling good. Like, I mean, the Tigers
Yeah.
are like, they're rolling. Like, and it's look. I don't know if the Braves are going to make the playoffs, but I'll tell you what, sweeping the Mets is like a damn good feeling. Like, I will never ever apologize for that. Like, the Braves could be like as bad as the Rockies, and if we sweep the Mets, I'm gonna parade around about it. So I guess just some housekeeping things. So the AD search hasn't really been a word. Like, I know recently in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, President Cabrera said that they were trying to work quickly to fill this. As of 11:31 on Friday, June 20th, 2025, there's been no word about that. So it's just kind of wait and see. Like, John Palumbo, I talked about it. He was at James Ramsey's introductory press conference a couple weeks ago, or I guess it was just last Monday. And he was asked about, hey, would you want to throw your name into the ring? Like, are you interested in taking the job? And he predictably, just said, hey, this is about James Ramsey. This is his day. I'm not going to answer that right now. And he's kind of been laying low. Like, there hasn't been anything. And this is the most quiet part of the year when it comes to college athletics. Like, with the College World Series winding down, like, that's pretty much the end of the athletic calendar for a while. And then, things will start ramping up towards the end of July. Like I said, media days will be coming up, football will be around the corner, but also a lot of other sports as well. So we'll update you whenever we have anything on that. Football has been hot on the recruiting trail. They even picked up a punter this morning that they offered a couple of days ago. Worked out in front of special teams coach Tim Salem, but man, they've been picking up receiver, linebacker. Like, they have really done a nice job this week. Their class has, I know not everybody cares about recruiting class rankings, but it's nearly into the top 30 right now. So, like, we could be on the verge of Georgia Tech knocking on the door of back-to-back top 25 classes. There's still a lot of top targets on the board. I know there have been a couple of misses as well, but I know a big one next weekend. Craig Dandridge, receiver, in-state receiver from Georgia, 4-star receiver. He put on a show at the Corky Kell 7-on-7, which has been taking place all week up there on campus at the indoor practice facility and all around there. I know they're really working hard to try to get him. I know Najee was there yesterday. Like, he's our guy recruiting. He's been all over this stuff. Definitely go read all that stuff. But recruiting is pretty hot right now. Both, and also with baseball, like they picked up quite a few players this week. I know they're in the mix for several others. So just some little stuff to get in. You got any thoughts on any of that?
I mean, no, I think it's just a testament to how good Brent Key has been in the recruiting trail. Like, you talk about the Hurd brothers, The receivers, obviously the punter from Atlanta. That's a big pickup, as we know. Um, I just think Brent Key has done a great job in the recruiting trail. And again, it's a little early on the 2026 cycle, but there's still a lot of guys committing. Like this is the season to get a lot of your 2026 guys, and a couple of them will, come in the spring. But this is the time, and I think you got a good base for a good recruiting class. So you just have to keep going.
Yeah, and like I know it feels early, but this is honestly the time when a lot of classes take shape. I'm not saying your class is going to be completely finished, but man, June and July are those are the recruiting months. Like that's when you really feel your class out. If you want to kind of know a little bit more about the recruiting landscape, I'm sure some of it might be a little dated because of the commitment stuff, but go listen to the episode I recorded with Najee last week. I mean, he really did a fantastic job. He's been on the trail going to these 7-on-7s and being there. Like he puts in a lot of hard work. So shout out to him for doing that and bringing a lot of knowledge to the show about that. But you ready to do a little schedule deep dive?
Yes, sir.
All right. So, I know the easiest way to do it is just ranking opponents from easiest to hardest. And in a sense, we're going to do that. But I think, we also want to put some things in context. Like it's not just about, I think one of the things – a couple of points I wanted to make. One of the things, about I've brought up when we've done this before in the past couple of years is like the schedule looked absolutely daunting on paper. I've always made the point, generally the probability that every single one of those teams hits at like they're projected to is pretty small. And like, you get a couple of duds. Like, we made the point last year, like, hey, NC State is a top, I think they were ranked in the top 25 to start the season. They ended up not being a very good team. Virginia Tech was everybody's except ours was a preseason favorite to be a dark horse to get to the ACC championship and be a really good team. They were very disappointing. Florida State was obviously incredibly disappointing. Doesn't mean the schedule for Tech wasn't hard, but it just when you have a lot of those teams on there, like, odds are some of them are going to disappoint. And I kind of want to make the opposite point going into this year. Like I know the sentiment is like, yeah, Clemson's on the schedule again. Georgia is, of course, on the schedule, but the rest of it is, I've heard the word easy going around, and I think it's the easiest in a while for Tech, but I do think there are teams on here that could be much better than projected. Like some of these teams are just like the first few that we're going to talk about on the easier end of the spectrum for Tech, like we know they're not going to be good, but there is ways for some of these teams to surprise. So I think it's like the opposite thing working in effect here. And another thing you have to take into account is, when do games occur? Even if you think a team might not be as good as some others, I think, when games do occur and, what they come before are really important. Anything else, you wanted to mention before we get into it?
Yeah, well, not a lot other than I think the way that the schedule is formatted with some of the games that you have back to back, I think Georgia Tech does have the opportunity to finish the season really good if you pick up a couple of marquee wins, either early in the season or at the back end of the season. Like I think Georgia Tech's record could be a lot better than people think.
Yeah, and like one of the things I want to point out about the schedule is like they don't play 2 consecutive weeks on the road.
Yeah.
And like let me explain. Like I know they played 2 consecutive road games, so like They go to NC State November 1st, but they have a bye week before they go to Boston College. Like they don't have 2 consecutive weeks where they're playing a road game because like when they go to Wake Forest, they have a bye week and then a home game against Virginia Tech. When they go to Duke, you have a home game against Syracuse the next week, and then so on and so forth. Like at Colorado, you play home game against Gardner-Webb the next week. So that I think that's a huge advantage to them. And there's not a lot of long road trips like and I say that in context of last year where obviously you had the Ireland trip, and I know that wasn't a road environment per se, but there were a lot of Florida State fans there. Like you could hear it on the TV and watching the game and everything. And then a couple weeks later you had to fly all the way up to Syracuse, like your 2 longest road trips of the season, and like you had to make in the first couple of weeks of the season. You do have a trip to Boston College that is a pretty far trip. I won't say hard trip towards the end of the season. And then you have to go to Colorado to start the season. Those are your 2 longest road trips, but they're on just completely, opposite ends of the season. But then, like you don't like the trip to Wake Forest is not a long trip. The trip to Duke, not a long trip. NC State, likewise. So you don't really have a lot of very far trips to go this year. So I think it's a very manageable from that standpoint.
Yeah, and honestly, the fact that you only play 5 road games in general is just a help to Georgia Tech. But the reason why I say that is the beginning of that schedule: Gardner Webb, Clemson, and Temple. Obviously, Clemson's going to be very good this year, and we're going to talk about that later. But the way that that schedule is set up with Gardner Webb and Temple, um, kind of helping that Clemson game, get the most authority that it can get. I think that puts Georgia Tech in the best position for an upset versus if you had to play Clemson a week earlier, a week before, and then having that game butt up to the Colorado game. I think that's where you get some uncertainty, but I honestly think all of the really hard games are perfectly laid out on the schedule to where every game can be prepared for in its own time. So I think Tech's in a very good spot.
Yeah. So I guess let's start it off by we're going to do the ranking the opponents from easiest to hardest. And I think 12 and 11 were pretty easy calls, and no disrespect to the Gardner Webb and the Temple fans out there. Look, Gardner Webb is not a very good FCS team. Like they're if there was a higher caliber FCS team on there, it could be a kind of a trap spot because that game is sandwiched in between. Okay, you're coming back from Colorado, the Friday night game, and then you have arguably one of your 2 biggest games of the season. I didn't want to say it was the biggest game, but it is a conference game. Clemson's going to be a top 5 team. They could lose to LSU week 1, but they're going to be ranked really high. They're going to be ranked coming into that game. It is kind of a weird sandwich spot, but that's where the schedule is just so advantageous to Georgia Tech. Is like you have that game in this spot. Like look, Brent Key will never ever, and I've seen him. When they played FCS opponents the past couple of years. He always talks about to us when we, go to the press conferences during that week of the game, like, there's no easy opponent, blah, blah, blah. And some of the coach speak, but I do think like he wants his team to believe that. But like Gardner Webb is not going to be a very good team. And then I'll touch on Temple real quick. I think there are a large number of FCS teams that would be favored over Temple. Like Temple is probably one of the 5 worst teams this year in the FBS. Like they are really. I like their coaching staff. I think they could get it turned around, but Temple's a tough job, and I just think roster-wise, that team's going to be really tough this year. And again, it just comes at a very good time because what if you were coming off winning against Clemson, and what if instead of Temple you had to go play at Boston College, or that was when you played Duke, or that was when you played NC State? This is where this comes into advantage for Georgia Tech is, okay, whether you win or lose against Clemson, you got a pick-me-up game next week against Temple. Could they come out a little slow and sluggish? Always a possibility, but like there's no doubt in my mind that they will win both of these games, which is why I have them at 12 and 11.
Yeah, and to put it in the cleanest way possible, like Temple just sucked last year. And I understand, like, this is going to be a much different Temple team, and I honestly don't think Temple is as bad as you think they are. Brought in 2 new coordinators, brought in Casey Keeler at head coach, Jay Ducker at running back. Like, I think there are some pieces on this Temple team. Now, do I think they're going to compete with Georgia Tech? I don't think so. I think they'll be a solid AAC team. End of sentence. Like I don't think there'll be much of competition, but I don't think they're like bottom 5 FBS level teams.
We'll check in back on that later in the season. Now you've got me. I have to watch Temple the rest of the season. Like I have to be proven right on this. So number 10, I do think was also easy for me. It was at Wake Forest. Like to me, them or Stanford is the worst team in the ACC, and it's a little bit like how you're just talking about Temple. And I'm not at all like Wake Forest is better than Temple. Like don't. I'm not saying that. I think Jake Dicker is an excellent coach. He did a really good job at Washington State. You look at his resume, like he's the guy that got Cam Ward to Washington State before he left for Miami. Like the last 2 quarterbacks he's coached were Cam Ward and John Mateer. And like John Mateer is supposed to be a really good player for Oklahoma this year. I think he'll be a good player for Oklahoma this year. I think he does a good job of identifying talent at quarterback and developing them. Like he does a really good job of that. And he's like, it's just going to be, this is like I'm sure college football fans are familiar with the year 0 term. Like I just think this is going to be a very tough first year, and it's just going to be kind of the year zero thing with Dickert. Like, they're a transfer heavy team. Like their quarterback situation. Like, I mean, Robbie Ashford's in contention to start there. Like that is just not what. No, and look, I think eventually he can get it going. Like Dave Clawson did a really good job there, but I just think this year is just going to be very tough, and I just don't think they're going to be a very good team.
Yeah, and that's honestly my problem with a lot of these teams that I have on the easier part of the schedule is there are a lot of teams in the ACC simply in a rebuild year, and we'll talk about that later. I think there are some talented position groups on this team. Like I think Claiborne is an amazing running back. We've seen that for years. I think their safety room is pretty solid. But just going through the entirety of this roster, you don't have a lot of high-level transfers. You have a decent amount of transfers. It's just putting that together, and we've seen teams that rely heavily on transfers. It's just not a good recipe. I don't think Wake Forest is going to be much better than a bottom 5 team in the ACC at best. Even though this game is on the road, I think this is by far your easiest road game of the year. And I think this is the other ones, I don't know if I would consider it, but these top 3 games, I would all consider them a must win. Like you have to beat Wake Forest.
Yeah, agree. So number 9, this could be where we differ, but so I did have at Boston College at number 9.
Okay, I had Syracuse.
Well, so those were the 2 I was going back and forth on, and I actually, go back to our ACC Power Rankings episode. I did have Boston College above Syracuse, but I do think the Syracuse game is sandwiched in like it's after the trip to Duke, which I will get into that a little bit later. I think that's going to be a tough game, and it's right before you go to NC State, which is also a tough place to play and one of Georgia Tech's harder games, which again we'll get into in a little bit. And I also think Syracuse, while I'm not very high on them this year because, they're losing Kyle McCord, Aronde Gadsden, LaQuinn Allen, Trevor Pena went to Penn State out of the portal, lost some of your best defensive players as well. I do wonder if by the end of October, I wonder how they'll look because it's, again, a transfer-heavy team. You got Steve Angeli from Notre Dame. I assume he's going to be the quarterback for them this year. He could be kind of picking up his confidence and kind of getting the offense rolling and with all the new pieces. And again, just to me, where it's sandwiched at is a tough part on the schedule because you could either be coming off a really tough win or possibly a tough loss to Duke. And also like, hey, we got a road trip and then a bye week. So it's like, but it is at home. And that's why it's in the 8-9 range. Like, yeah, it's in a little bit of a funky spot, but I also think Georgia Tech on paper is just a much stronger team than Syracuse. And obviously, like, I'm not this kind of guy, and I don't get into all this stuff a lot, but I do think there's going to be some extra motivation to win that game for reasons I'm sure Tech fans know.
Yeah, and we talked about this a million times. Everything that made Syracuse this magical ACC dark horse, whatever you want to call whatever that 2024 season was, every player that made that team special is essentially gone. Like you lost Marlo Wax, you lost pretty much everybody on offense that was productive. And this is just the rebuild year for Fran Brown. And for a lot of reasons, I don't want to give Fran Brown this credit, but we saw last year how Fran Brown, he can have a transfer-heavy team and be successful. And that's why I'm kind of weary about this game. But I just don't think the level of talent is there. I don't think you have the same level of quarterback as last year. And that game's at Bobby Dodd. So I think for a lot of reasons, that's where I have that game at. And then I have Boston College afterward.
Yeah, and I guess let's just talk about the Boston College. The reason I had it is a slightly easier game. Yes, it is on the road. And actually, I do think Boston College, while it's not like a Penn State or an LSU home atmosphere, I do think Boston College is like a low-key underrated. Yeah. Like there have been games up there where, I watched USC go up there, and I didn't watch it. I watched it on TV, but like I went there. USC went up at there as like a top 15 team one time, and they lost. Like there have been games where it does happen. I remember them clipping Miami a few years ago when Miami come in there. I think they were ranked. I just think you have a bye week to prepare for it. I think that's the thing. Before you go up there and do that, you have a bye week to get ready for it, and then it's kind of the stretch into the season. And then there's obviously a lot of questions with Boston College as well. Like, the QB, like is it Grayson James? Is it Dylan Lonergan? I have questions about their defense. You lose your top pass rusher like that. I do like some of the receivers. Like I do think like there's a chance Boston College does go to a bowl game again, but I just think it's in a more favorable part of the schedule than say Syracuse, and that's where like I kind of view Boston College and Syracuse as similar teams. So it's like where it is in the schedule to me is kind of what made the tiebreaker.
Yeah, the only reason I had them at that part was also schedule related. I just think with Boston College, with their quarterback battle, my hope is that Lonergan can figure it out for Boston College. Like, obviously, I don't want them to beat Tech, but I want Boston College to succeed with Bill O'Brien as their head coach. And I think Lonergan, with the way this offense is set up, can be pretty good. And at that point in the season, I think their offense will be figured out. I think they'll have a full-time QB. Maybe it'll be Lonergan. Maybe it won't be. But I would have much rather played Boston College earlier in the season than later because, just of the, I don't want to say issue at quarterback, just because of the battle that they have ongoing.
This game could have been a couple of spots higher to me if you swapped that in the Pitt game. Like if you had to go to Boston College before you played Georgia, like that is a trap game. Like that's like a red alarm trap game. Like Georgia Tech's better than Boston College, but like, oh, you've got to go play your last conference game with a game that everybody's going to be looking forward to with the Georgia game. Just it's a rivalry, obviously, given the way last year's game played out. That's going to be a game we're all looking forward to. Oh, we got to go all the way up to Chestnut Hill and play a game. That could be a very sleepy game. But to me, getting that and then having Pitt afterwards, which is a game we're going to talk about in just a second, I do think I would have had that game a couple spots higher if you just swapped that a little bit.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
So number 7, this was another debate I had, and it was between Virginia Tech and Pitt. Who did you have at 7?
I actually had NC State.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, go just dig into that because I had NC State in the top 5.
Yeah, this area, the NC State, Pitt, Virginia Tech area was pretty hard for me to pick just because I've seen what these quarterbacks can do at Pitt, at NC State, at Virginia Tech. And I do think C.J. Bailey might be the best out of that group. But there's a lot of uncertainty with this NC State team. Like, they cleared house with their coordinators, and this just isn't the same team that we've had from last year's. There's not a lot of returning starters. And where it's at on the schedule, again, I think is kind of favorable. But we talked about Syracuse, we talked about Boston College. Like, those are going to be 2 kind of tricky games. But with this game being on the road, with it being where it's at, I honestly think Pitt and Virginia Tech are going to be 2 harder games than playing at NC State.
So I will make the counter argument to that. And yet, Tony Gibson, who's a really good defensive coordinator under Dave Dorn, he's a head coach at Marshall now. I do have a lot of roster questions about NC State, but I do think their offense has like some real sneaky upside with Bailey, Hollywood Smothers, their receivers. Like I know Concepcion is going, but they still, and Dakari Collins, I think, left for Louisville, I believe. So I still think they have some good talent there. To me, I had it at number 5. I like having an immense amount of respect for the crowd and the atmosphere in Raleigh. Like, again, I remember Florida State being ranked number 3, going in there against an NC State team that was just okay, pretty good, and they lost. And it, like, cost them a shot at the BCS championship. I think it was, like, 2012. That's a really tough atmosphere to go and play in. And, look, it's also – right before the bye week, you're towards the tail end of the season, and I'm kind of interested to see how NC State's defense will look then. Again, with Gibson gone as the head coach at Marshall now, like their defense fell off a cliff last year. Like it was just really bad. Like I'm always used to NC State having one of the best defenses in the ACC and like a genuine top 25, top 20 unit in the country. It was just bad last year, so I'm kind of interested to see like if there's a bounce back in there for them. But like, I just have an immense amount of respect for the fans there and the atmosphere that they create. Like, it's a really tough place to play. It's a November game. It would even be higher on this list if you put it on a Thursday. Like, if you have the Thursday night trip to Raleigh, like I think that would be just really tough. But that's why I had them number 5. So I guess we can do the Pitt Virginia Tech thing. So I actually had Virginia Tech at 7, even though I do think they're a slightly better team than Pitt. And it just goes back to the scheduling conundrum. Is the Pitt game is right before the Georgia game. I'm sure Georgia Tech will be prepared, but there's just always the chance you're looking ahead a little bit. And, Pitt, there are pieces there for Pitt to be a good football team this year. They had the hot start last year, 7-0, and they kind of came back down to earth. Obviously, I remember they went to SMU and got absolutely smacked, and that kind of sent their season in kind of a tailspin of sorts. Made a bowl game. Now, who was it they lost to? You were at that game, right?
Oh, Toledo.
Yeah, the
In the
bowl
game
game.
above Sports Bowl.
Yeah, those Midwest bowl games, man. Um, Yeah, and so I'm very fascinated to see them. We talked about it in our power rankings episode. I think Desmond Reed is one of the most underrated backs in the entire country. I think he's a stud. And I just think that game's in just a tricky spot. So that's why I had them one spot above Virginia Tech, even though you could argue on the margins Virginia Tech's a better team. But I think the spot on the schedule is pretty favorable. Like, you're coming off a bye week. Yeah, you do have Duke the next week, but I think Georgia Tech will be ready for Virginia Tech. And then to me, they're just a giant mystery. Like, you had two new coordinators there, a team. Virginia Tech had the second most players drafted out of the ACC this season. I don't know if many people were like, that team had some legit talent. You also had a lot of your other top talent leaving the transfer portal. They had some land at LSU. You had some land elsewhere like that. There's a chance that these new transfers and new coordinators, they just mesh and are a much better team, because one thing about them last year is they lost a ton of one-score games, whether it was to Rutgers. We all remember the Miami game. Now, they lost to Duke, right? Yeah, they lost to Duke in a close game last year. So I do think there's a chance they bounce back, but I think it's in a slightly more advantageous position, even though you do have a big ACC game next week against Duke. But I assume that was you. Where did you have Pitt and Virginia Tech?
I had them switch. So I had Pitt at 6 and Virginia Tech at 5. And the reason why I made that switch is because with the uncertainty at Virginia Tech, with Kyron Drones at quarterback, Philip Montgomery obviously taking over, we've seen what he's done with Robert Griffin III. Now, I know Kyron Drones is not a Robert Griffin level talent, but I think there's a lot of untapped potential there where that game could kind of scare me because, I mean, the Virginia Tech game last year was just ugly. But I think this is a make or break year for Brent Pry. He brought in two new coordinators that I think are both better than the two coordinators they had before. A lot of talent in its skill positions on offense. And there's a decent amount of uncertainty on a lot of places on this team. But the reason why I have them above Pitt is because I just think their ceiling is really high. And I think that with Pitt too. But I think if Philip Montgomery really, really, really clicks with Kyron Drones, I think that offense could be scary. And then I had Pitt at 6 over NC State. Again, that's another offense that I think has a lot of talent. We've seen what a Caudell and Eli Holstein offense could look like. We saw the 7-0 start last year.
Which one's the real one, though? Is it the one that started the season hot, or is it the one that ended on a losing streak? That's what I can't figure out about Pitt.
See, that's what I see. I think it got to a point last year where you almost gave up, but I think they're coming in back with vengeance. I think Eli Holstein is mad, not only with how the season ended, but with his performance at times. And I think there's some guys in this defense. I think you got Kyle Lewis. I think you got Rasheem Biles, who had really productive seasons last year. I think Pitt could be really good. Those two games honestly scare me more than NC State, just because I think the amount of talent at Pitt and at Virginia Tech is much larger than at NC State. And I think CJ Bailey might be the best player out of the bunch, out of the three teams. But overall, I think Virginia Tech and Pitt are much more talented rosters.
Yeah. I mean, for Pitt last year in the first 7 games, they had 55 points, 28 points, 38 points, 73 points, 34 points, 17 points, 41 points. The losses, and they did have 46 points in a 6 overtime game against Toledo, but in the 5 regular season games to end the season on the losing streak, 25, 19, 29, 23. So I am genuinely interested to see which offense of theirs is there by the end of the season. But I guess let's get into the top 4, because we do have the same 4, I believe in. So I had number 4. I had Colorado.
Number 4, I had at Duke.
Okay, so
I think our top 2 is the same order.
yeah, a good chance to talk about these two. Colorado is a massive mystery going into the year, and having it as your first game, I think where the game is on the schedule and the fact the game is on the road to me makes this a very tricky spot. Look, I haven't made like any official predictions for anything yet. I know Georgia Tech is favored in this game, I think by like 3.5 or 4, which, does say that like Vegas thinks they're a better team, and I know that seems like, oh yeah, Captain Obvious they're favored, but like on a neutral field, if you take away the home field, like Georgia Tech's probably they think a touchdown better than Colorado, but there are unknowns here. The biggest one to me is obviously Caden Salter. I'm just very, a couple years ago at Liberty, he got them to the Fiesta Bowl. They had undefeated season. Yeah, they were undefeated, correct? And then they lost to Oregon. He entered the transfer portal, didn't go anywhere, came back to Liberty, and that team just seemed really off all year. Like they had the loss to Kennesaw State. They ended up, like Liberty in terms of roster and resources and stuff, like they are far superior. Like Conference USA, there are some FCS teams I think that would win that conference. Like that conference is not good. And he really struggled all last year. Another thing I'm interested in, and we talked about this before the show, look, I think Jamie Chadwell is one of the best offensive coaches in all of college football. I think his system, I think the way he can scheme guys open, the run game, I think it's all really good. We all remember how good Grayson McCall was at Coastal Carolina under Chadwell. And I know he did get injured last year at NC State, but before that, he wasn't really playing very well. And I do wonder if you take somebody like that out of Jamie Chadwell's system, how good are they? That's just a mystery I have with Salter is, okay, was last year a result of maybe he really didn't want to be there. He wanted to transfer out, but couldn't find the spot. I don't know. So I'm fascinated to see how well Salter plays because I do think, like, I know there's a lot of hype around Juju Lewis, and I think he's a really good freshman quarterback, but I just have a very hard time even seeing Dion rolling him out there in a big week 1 game at home because, Colorado's win total right now is projected around 6.5. Like this is a game they probably need to get to and win, like especially to build some early momentum. Like they're going to see this as a game that they can win. Obviously, Travis Hunter is going as well. They're having to replace a few top receivers. Their defense was slightly better last year. It wasn't like a dominating unit, but the fact that the game's on the road, it's the first game of the season, and look, Georgia Tech could be much better. They could win 10 games this year, and Colorado goes 6-6, but Colorado could beat Georgia Tech. Like it's just on the spot of the schedule. We talked about it before the Florida State game last year. One of the reasons me and you both picked Georgia Tech to beat Florida State last year was, hey, this is week 0. It's a funky spot. Like college teams, like sometimes they don't come out and play well right out of the gates, especially in this transfer portal era where you have a lot of new guys trying to mesh together. Now, I think the advantage with Tech here is, Haynes King is back. Jamal Haynes is back. You coach and staff continuity, especially on the offensive side, defensive side too, but Gideon is there. But there are some unknowns here, and it's like, okay, what if Georgia Tech's defensive line struggles right out of the gate? What if some of these new pieces on the offensive line, at center, right tackle, what if they don't mesh immediately? Maybe they do later in the year, but what if they don't immediately? Same thing with receiver. There's a lot of unknowns there, so it's like it's a tricky spot.
Yeah, and honestly, to to start where you started, I think Caden Salter, I think he is an electric quarterback, and I think we saw that. I don't know if that's going to translate to against Power 5 talent, and I think he's very talented, and I think Juju Lewis is very talented. We're not going to see Lewis in this game. Um, I think Colorado has a ton of pieces, and there's a lot of teams that have said this for, but Colorado is another team that has relied heavily on the transfer portal since Deion Sanders has taken over. They have a bunch of talent, like Jaheim Otis on defense. I think he will make that run game better. And honestly, I might have rather played last year's Colorado just because of how abysmal that run defense was at times. Because I think Haynes King would run circles around last year's run defense at Colorado. I think this defensive unit at Colorado is not that bad. I think Caden Salter can be really good. It's just we don't know. Um, they only have 3 returning starters on defense. they honestly don't have that many returning starters, much of anywhere. Got a lot of offensive linemen to replace. Obviously, the big gap at receiver. I could see this game going either way.
I
Like I
was
think
literally about
something could take over this game, but it could be a Georgia Tech Buster Faulkner masterclass. I really don't know how to feel this game. Like I don't know how to
this
predict
is a
this one.
this is a high variance game of like
Yeah,
the 18th degree, dude. Like this is there are worlds in which I see Georgia Tech going in there and rolling over them. Like
yeah,
Colorado, a lot of guys left. Shadur and Travis, they can't replace them. Salter struggles. Like Tech has more experience at position, like again, quarterback, backfield. There is a world in which I see Georgia Tech just going in there and rolling them. And but maybe that's not indicative of where Colorado is going to be at the end of the season, but maybe their pieces just don't mesh right now. There is a world in which I don't. The one thing I don't see is like Colorado. I don't think is going to win this game by multiple touchdowns. Or like I don't see them doing that. But like there is a world, and again, which I was just saying, like what if Georgia Tech's what if, the defense comes out of the gate a little slow, first game under Gideon is he's never been a defensive coordinator before. I think he'll be a good hire, but like we don't know yet. Defensive line especially on the edge, you have some pieces there. If the offensive line doesn't mesh, there are ways, Colorado can get this one. Like this is just a very high variance game to me. Any result except Georgia Tech getting blown out, I think, is on the table. Like I think Georgia Tech can win it closer in a blowout. I think if Colorado wins, I do think it'll be a close game. But man, I will be there for that game, and I'm very interested to see how it goes.
yeah. I think we've got a pretty good grip on how good we think Georgia Tech is going to be next season, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. With Colorado, you could pretty much say anything about Colorado, and I would say you're right. Like, there's a lot of ways this season can go in the post Shitter Sanders era,
Yeah.
and I think we're gonna find out against Colorado week 1.
If you told me
how good
Colorado
that
was
team is.
5-7, I'd say okay.
Yeah.
If you told me Colorado was 9-3 and in the hunt for the Big 12 title, okay, sure.
Yep.
There's about like 11 teams probably that can win the Big 12. All right, we got to talk Duke here for a little bit. Look, I've been a believer in Duke. I go back to whenever we started talking about the schedule and everything. Like I think Duke is going to be a really good team. They were, I thought, a very underrated team last year. And look, I have to take the L last year. I thought they were going to be the worst team in the ACC last year. I thought they were going to be terrible. Like I didn't like the portal additions. I was skeptical of Malik Murphy. That was a really good football team last year. Look, I know the only game they lost by double digits, not including the bowl game, was the Miami game. And may I remind people, they led that game at one point in the second half. Like that wasn't like a Miami came out of the gates and stomped Duke. Like Duke had them at various points in the game, and then they just Cam Ward was pretty ridiculous in the second half of that game. I do think their schedule is tougher this year, but I think I think Malik Murphy was, even with Duke's record last year, I don't think he was very good. I kind of had a suspicion of that. Like that was the only thing about Duke last year that I got right at all. I didn't think Malik Murphy was that good. And I know the statistics look pretty good, but I can just tell you from when they came to Georgia Tech and they lost that game last year, 24-14, he hit one pass. Like Georgia Tech kind of said almost like an engage 8. Like if you're a video game person, like that was basically what Georgia Tech sent him one play. And he did find an open guy. The rest of that game was just really tough. And like that kind of raised some alarms for me because I didn't think Tech's secondary was that good last year because, we saw him get ripped apart by Louisville and Syracuse. And I was like, he's having trouble here. I think Darian Mensah from Tulane is a very possible big upgrade. I think the one thing with Mensah we're all waiting to see is, okay, I know the ACC is, you're not going to have the toughest defenses in there like some other conferences, but like it's a big step up from the AAC and facing that week in and week out. Like I'm very interested to see how that does. And then obviously this game is on the road. Like that is a big thing here. And Duke is going to be coming off a bye week while Georgia Tech is playing Virginia Tech. So Duke is going to have plenty of time to get ready for this one. I think another big thing with them is their entire coaching staff stayed. Like Manny Diaz got this whole group to stay. I know Manny Diaz kind of had a bad reputation as a head coach when he was at Miami. I think that was just kind of there were some just different things going on there. I think Manny Diaz is a good coach, especially on the defensive side of the football. I actually think they could have one of the best secondaries maybe in the country. Like, I think that secondary is going to be really, really good this year. Chandler Rivers is a very good player. I had this game as Georgia Tech's third toughest game of the year. I know we kind of flip-flopped on that in Colorado, but I think Duke is just an all-around better roster than Colorado. It's also on the road, and I think it's a slightly tough schedule spot as well.
Yeah, and like for these top four teams, Duke, Colorado, Georgia, Clemson, I think it's a significant step up from the rest of these games. Like the 6 easiest games, I would say if you lose those, that's a bad loss. If you lose any of these 4 games, I think most people would consider those a good loss. Obviously, you don't want to lose, but I think a loss to Duke would look a lot better than a loss to any of the teams that we've talked about before this, not named Colorado. Duke might honestly be better than they were last year and win less games.
Yeah.
They play Illinois, they play Tech, they play Clemson, they play Tulane.
And they go to Tulane as well. And look, I know Tulane is lost some good pieces of the roster, obviously Mensa being one of them. They're a good group of 5 team, and John Summerall's a really good coach. So yeah, that's a tough spot. And then I know they get a bye week after they play Tech, but then they go to Clemson. So that's tough. And on top of also playing – oh, no, they don't play Louisville. Never mind.
But yeah, what I think is funny about this Duke team, honestly, is they return every starter on offense besides quarterback and besides all 3 receivers. So I think this team – it does have a lot of continuity on offense, but you plug in Mensah to replace, Malik Murphy. Obviously, your defense is very talented. You got Chandler Rivers, Terry Moore, Vincent Anthony. Obviously, a Manny Diaz defense is going to be very good. This is probably, besides the Clemson game, pretty unanimously the most scary ACC matchup. Like, I think Duke is going to be very good. Close. Yeah. I don't think there's any other team. Like, I don't think Pitt, Virginia Tech, any of the other teams that you can name.
Doesn't mean that Tech can't lose any of those games, but it's just with all the factors we've talked about, roster, talent, coaching, where it is on the schedule, it's on the road. Like, I think this is like you can break the ACC schedule into tiers for Tech, and like Clemson's at the top, which we'll get into in a second. And I think Duke's in like a tier all by themselves.
Yeah.
So.
And the fact that it's on the road and the fact that, Duke is just a hard team to play against in general with any quarterback. That game kind of scares me, but not as much as Colorado. I think Duke is a more winnable game, but I think there's more opportunity against Duke for that game to go bad. Like, I can see that game going south. That defense really gets to the Haynes King and company. Like, I think it could be worse. But Colorado week 1 scares me just a little bit more.
Yep. And that's like a football nerds matchup. Like, that's paradise. Buster Faulkner versus Manny Diaz. Are you kidding? Yeah. Like, that's one of the top offensive minds in the country versus one of the best defensive minds in the country, like that. And to watch them go back and forth last year, like that game, like it wasn't like an instant class. I'm not going to portray that, but it was really interesting to see them try to counter each other and what they were doing last year. Like, I found it very interesting. All right, so I think everybody kind of assumed who we would have as the top 2. How did you have Georgia Clemson? In what order did you have them?
I had Georgia at 2, and I had Clemson as the hardest game. I'm a big believer
in
Clemson.
Flip-flop, so okay. Like, this would be interesting. So make the case for, and I know it's not like I think they'll be very similar teams in terms of like talent and stuff. And I think there honestly could be more questions with Georgia. Why did you have Clemson over Georgia?
Yeah, the reason why is Clemson pretty much returns every starter. I think there's like 3 positions on offense they didn't return a starter, 4 on defense they didn't return a starter. Tom Allen has an egregious amount of NFL talent to work with on the defense. I think this is the more complete team out of the 2. I think this is probably the most talented team on the schedule. This is the Cade Klubnik year. For how much some people don't believe in Cade Klubnik, this is the year he has to prove it. He has literally all of the weapons he could ever want. I think they're the most talented team in the ACC. With the Georgia game being at Mercedes-Benz, I think honestly at both of these games, you're going to have a very tough away crowd, even playing against Clemson. Like, those fans travel. But I think Clemson is, I would say, pretty handedly the better team. I think Cade Klubnik is miles above whatever Gunnar Stockton is. I think there's a lot of questions on the Georgia offense. Um, I just think Clemson is a lot more complete, and that's why I have them at number one.
So, like, I talked about my skepticism of Clemson on like a national stage. Look, I think they're very deserving of being the ACC favorite. I understand it. A lot of talent coming back. I do think, and I know this is not at all what people that listen to this podcast want to hear. I do think there is some. I'm starting to worry about the amount of shade and worry that Georgia's getting this year. Like it just this reeks to me of we're going to be at the end of September, mid October. Like, why did we say that about Georgia or anything? Because like I do I do get the point of putting Clemson above Georgia. Just I think there's a lot more proven. They're like, yeah, Cade Klubnik is more proven, even though like I still say go find me your favorite Cade Klubnik big game moments because there's not many of them. Like that's been my thing with him the whole time. Outside of last year's ACC title against SMU, he was terrible against Georgia. He was awful against Louisville. He was really bad against South Carolina. And I know he put up some yards against Texas. That game against Texas was never in question. So, like, I'm still skeptical. Like, I know he's good. I'm not saying he's not good. He's very good. I do think, like, Stockton can be pretty good. Do I think I would be surprised if he's like an NFL player. Like, I don't think he's that. I do think Georgia upgraded their receiver room quite a bit. I like the addition of the Illinois running back they got in the portal. I think Nate Frazier's obviously really talented. I do have some questions on the offensive line because their offensive line was really talented last year. I thought it was like an easy pick for one of the best in the country, and they kind of struggled like all season. So I'm wondering like how does that switch? And I know they lost Jalen Walker. I know they lost Malachi Starks. I know they lost Michael Williams. They recruit better than anybody. And I think there is going to be a bit of a chip on the shoulder this year for Georgia, given, you had just a lot of stuff last year with the Carson Beck stuff. And then, they ended the season losing to Notre Dame. I do think there is a chip on their shoulder element that they're going to bring this year that I'm very interested to see how it plays out. But I don't hate the argument that Clemson on paper might be better than Georgia. I don't know. I still just trust Georgia's coaching staff a lot to put a good team out there on the field. And I think also by the end of the year, I think, Georgia has a lot of new faces, but facing them at the end of the year, they're going to be we'll know who they are more by then. Like, they still have a ton of 4- and 5-star talent on the defensive side of the football. If Stockton is better than people think, I think that offense could be really good. Yeah, like Mike Bobo is not my favorite offensive coordinator either, but like I do think he's pretty good. I still have Georgia above Clemson, and I know some of that's I think Clemson's a really good team. I'm not buying some of the hype on them nationally, like ACC wise. Yes, sure. Like I think they can make the playoff in the ACC, whatever. I'm not buying them as a real national title contender yet, and I know that's an unpopular opinion, but it's mine.
Yeah, my problem with Georgia, again, I still think they're a really good team. I still think they're one of the best teams in the SEC. Obviously, like I don't think that's going to change for a while. They only returned 6 starters. And like interestingly enough, they got hit by the transfer portal and by the draft a decent amount. Like this is the first time in a while that I can say a Georgia Bulldog team is not going to have most of their star players from the year before. Like this is, I don't want to say a mass exodus because there's still a lot of talent, and I think Dylan Bell is really good, and I think there's a lot of really good players in this roster that they added, but there's a lot of question marks. Like, can you replace that offensive line? How good is Gunnar Stockton? And if he doesn't play to the level that Georgia expects him to play, I honestly don't think this Georgia team is as good as the national hype tells them. And to be brutally honest, I don't know if Smart takes the rivalry as serious as Brent Key does. Like Brent Key says,
I disagree with you there. I just don't think he wears it on his sleeve as much as Brent Key does.
Well, I think Brent Key, everything he wants in the world is to beat Georgia, and I think Kirby Smart is maybe focused on. I think they both take it serious.
I think, yeah, I get what you're saying. Like, I do think there's more of. I do think, like this is what Brent Key wants to do. Like,
Yeah.
he wants to beat Georgia and almost above anything else. I feel like maybe I'm over exaggerating there, but like I remember it was a press conference. Maybe it was Key's first year. So it was heading into the Georgia-Florida game, and somebody asked, it was a defensive player at Georgia, like, y'all kind of have a lot of rivalries. Like, you have, and they only mentioned Florida, Tennessee, and Auburn. And then he's like, well, if you ask Coach Smart, it's Georgia Tech. Like he wants to beat Georgia Tech above anybody else. And and that's what I just think, like, and I hope, as long as Georgia Tech continues their upward trajectory, that's what I think can make this like a super fun, not that it wasn't always a good rivalry, but like just a super fun part of it, with Key having played at Georgia Tech, Kirby having played at Georgia, and it means something to them. Like I just think that's what makes some of these rivalries in college football a whole lot funner, when you have that element to it. But yeah, I think you can really nitpick about who's the top two. I think it's obviously Georgia or Clemson. There's not even like a very contrarian hot take case to make for anybody else. There's just not any argument I can make for any other team on this. It's clearly Georgia, Clemson. But I think, stepping back and taking a big picture look at it, I think Georgia Tech has a chance to have a very advantageous schedule. Look, there's not a ton of, any trap game opportunities, whether it's, the game before Clemson, you're playing Gardner-Webb, and the game after you're playing Temple. So it's like you're kind of safeguarded in that way. It's like, okay, if we win or lose against Clemson, like, we have a get-right game next week. And against a team that has, like, to me, virtually zero shot at winning. Like, I think Temple's going to be really bad. Yes, the Duke game's on the road. Yeah, they're coming off Virginia Tech. Like that's a bit of a tricky spot. The Pitt game being above Georgia is a tricky spot, but it's like, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way at all, but it's Pitt. You're not playing you're not playing Louisville. You don't have to go to Louisville before you play Georgia. You don't have to play SMU before you play Georgia. Like there's not a lot of just super tricky spots on the schedule. And I really think they need to take advantage of that this year, because look, Tech has done well in big ranked games before, but the schedules are going to get much harder the next couple of years. Look, next year's non-conference schedule, 3 of your games are Colorado, Tennessee, and Georgia. The year after that, 2027, it's Tennessee, Georgia, Notre Dame. Like and then you're going to cycle back in. I know next year they play SMU. I know 2027, I think, is when they face Miami again in the regular season. So like you'll cycle through back some of these top programs. I think they play Florida State next year. And look, I know Florida State was terrible this past year, but there's a good chance that game, because that game is in Tallahassee, they should be better than they were this past year. Give them a couple of years. That game's tough. Like I think, you really have an advantageous schedule, and I think they really need to take advantage of it this year.
Yeah, and before I go to like the large scale schedule, I do want to make one point about Georgia. I think in Key's tenure, we've seen every year they play Georgia a little bit closer and a little bit closer and a little bit closer, and it feels like Georgia Tech is always one of the hardest games on Georgia's schedule. So I think there is some room, some cautious optimism, I'm going to say, about that game being at Mercedes-Benz. I think Georgia Tech has a higher chance of beating Georgia than they do Clemson. But overall, looking at the schedule, I think this is the year where we've talked about how Brent Key has completely done a 180 with the Georgia Tech football program. But to, prove yourself as an ACC powerhouse, I think this is the year where you kind of have to dominate your schedule. You have to prove that you can win big games. I think you got to take one of the Colorado or the Duke games, and I think you have to show that, hey, Georgia Tech is not this fluky team from years past. Like, I think Georgia Tech is a very talented team, and if they can win the games at the right times, start off 2-0, heading to Clemson, maybe play that game close, maybe even win that game, I think you put yourself in a really, really, really good spot for Georgia Tech to be ranked, because you don't play Duke until mid-October. I just think there's a lot of good spots for Georgia Tech to establish themselves, possibly for an ACC championship run. I think Miami and Clemson have the two most talented rosters, but with the way the schedule is, I wouldn't be shocked with an ACC championship berth this year, and I honestly think that's the goal for the season.
Yeah, when I went and looked at all of them, like the only team in the ACC to me that has an easier schedule than Georgia Tech is Virginia. And I'm not going to deep dive that right now, but I implore everybody to please go look at that Virginia schedule and like just bask in its aura of how easy it is. But yeah, like I think that's a good wrap on it. Look, I'll just make this point again to kind of put a pin in the discussion about the schedule. There are teams on here that we talked about that could be better than you think. I always made the point, when I say, hey, Georgia Tech's going to go over their win total of 4.5, 5.5 these past couple of years. Like I thought it was an easy one. It's like, yeah, like last year, I think preseason top teams they faced, like it was Florida State, Georgia, Miami, Virginia Tech, NC State, Notre Dame. Like half their schedules preseason ranked opponents. But I was like, some of these teams are not going to be as good as you think, and it was that rang true with Virginia Tech and NC State. They were able to get one against Miami and Florida State. They were able to win 4 out of those games. Some of these teams can be better than you think. Like if Kyron Jones stays healthy and these new coordinators click for Virginia Tech, that could be a much tougher game than you think. Same thing with Pitt. Not only is it right before the Georgia game, but there is talent on that offense and they have a good coordinator. Like, hey, that could be a really tough test. Your eyes might be on Georgia, but like Pitt could be really good. I think there's a chance Boston College can be a lot tougher than people think. Like they have good talent. I think Bill O'Brien's a solid coach. I think he's a little overrated, but I think he's a good coach. And it's on the road. So yeah, I think there's always a chance that some of these teams can be a little bit better than you think. And one thing, this is actually the last point I'm going to make. One thing we've talked about these first couple of years of Brent Key at Georgia Tech was, look, he does tremendous in ranked games, in big games. Even sometimes he doesn't win them. Like you go back to like the interim year, you beat Pitt in North Carolina. You played Georgia tight for like 2.5 quarters, a lot tougher than anybody remotely thought you would. Then, you pulled another upset against North Carolina in 2023. You had the knee game against Miami. You had some upsets there. Then last year, another upset against Miami. The season opener against Florida State, and then taking Georgia to the brink in 8 overtimes. But it's the week-to-week consistency. It's okay, yeah. So if you do beat Clemson, like, okay, can you be mature enough to go handle your business against Temple and Wake Forest and then have a bye week? And then, hey, Virginia Tech's at home. You're better than Virginia Tech. Can you win? Because a lot of these games, they're outside of Temple, Gardner-Webb, and probably Wake Forest, even though Wake Forest is on the road. I don't know that any other games at Georgia Tech is going to be favored by double digits. And I know some people don't care about being favored, not being favored. Tech hasn't done extremely well as a favorite under Key. And you're probably going to be favored against Virginia Tech. I don't know that it's going to be by more than a touchdown. You're going to be favored against Syracuse. I don't know that that's going to be more than a touchdown. So it's like there's a lot of coin flip games on here. And you got to show you're able to win them and take advantage of it. Maybe they can. They got to avoid stubbing their toe, though.
Yeah, I mean, you have to win the games that you should win. I think, like we talked about, I think there's 6 games on the schedule where Georgia Tech, again, not double-digit, but I think they're going to handedly be the favorite. And I think you have to show.
I mean, you can make the case they're going to be favored in 10 games this year.
Yeah.
I don't know that they'll be favored at Duke, but it's a coin flip. I don't know that they'll be favored at NC State, but it's a coin flip. The only 2 games you're going to be an underdog, like under almost any circumstance, is Clemson and Georgia.
Yeah. 99 times out of 100, you're going to be underdogs. But I think if you win the games that you need to win and you drop we've seen what Brent Key can do as an underdog against very, very, very good teams like Miami last year. If you can just handle your business. Don't lose against the teams that you shouldn't lose to. Drop one game here or there. Pick up some upsets. I think that's honestly the best case scenario.
Yep. Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, we hope everybody has enjoyed this schedule deep dive, especially a near end of June, college football schedule deep dive podcast. But we did want to kind of take a look at it. We're obviously we're getting closer and closer to the season starting, media days, fall camp, all that's going to be starting here in the next month plus. So appreciate everybody tuning in. If you haven't already, I'm gonna say it again. Would love it if you guys would subscribe to the channel. If you haven't already, just like the video, follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a review over there. We love reading what you guys have to say about the show and ways we can make it better. Always on the lookout for that. Appreciate you guys tuning in, and we will see you next time.